More than one of the town residents said that the dog had stayed with Brenda Leroy until the ambulance arrived. That Pete Gary, who called 911, found the dog sitting on her chest. That Scott Hernandez, the first response officer, had to lift the dog off her, and that tugging on the leash had yielded only resistance. In retellings, this was a part of the story that got furrowed brows and hands to chests, yet some felt the detail to be implausible. After all, no one knew how much time had passed between her being hit and being discovered when Pete was driving home from his shift half an hour early so as to make the tip-off of his daughter's basketball game. It had been 6:30 p.m. on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving in this New England college town. The night was clear. She had apparently been walking her dog, that Australian Shepard mix she had rescued against most of her friends' advice 5 years earlier. Her life, they had pointed out, was already a house of cards. One boy, 19, who she had to agree came with his own brand of parental challenges. A double mortgage on a house that had once been an actual chicken coop, bought at the height of the market. Her health problems, diabetes and chronic back pain, which had meant one job after another over the last 2 decades. "You have dogs," she'd countered when her friends had argued against her getting one. Amy Price had answered, "But we have help." Brenda knew help meant husbands, which Brenda did not have, had never had, and though she was only 42, believed she would never have. She had thanked them for their advice and returned to the shelter the next day to sign the papers. The car, the police department concluded based on 2 rivets found at the scene, was a late model Honda. Some suggested this investigation might be beyond the crack capabilities of the local police force. More than a few residents, owners of late model CRVs or Accords, scanned their brains for where they'd been Tuesday evening. Could they have hit somebody and not known it? They asked themselves before dismissing the possibility. Lisa Miller called her husband as soon as she heard. "Are you in the Odyssey?" she said. "Were you driving down Tipton Lane at 5 or 6? Fred Miller said what he always said when faced with his wife's mild, usually harmless hysterics. "The big picture, please. Paint the big picture." When she was done repeating what she'd heard from Sarah Hughes, who had heard from Abigail Bronkowski, who had a police scanner and whose father was a volunteer fireman, Fred Miller took a breath and asked if his wife was really suggesting that her husband of 22 years might have hit a woman with his car, left her in the road, and kept driving. Lisa wondered if he might have thought it was a pothole or a branch. "A branch?" he said. He told her he was hanging up now and would see her at home, and she sat with the phone to her ear long after he was off, defensive and grim about the way her anxieties were dismissed in their long and otherwise happy marriage. Scott Hernandez had held the dog's leash while the paramedics stabilized Brenda's back and neck and loaded her into the ambulance. After they'd driven away, the dog had whined quietly and licked at Scott's hand. He was the shape and size of an Australian Shepherd with the long layered fur, but had the blocky head of a lab. Scott would have said he didn't like dogs much, but this was a belief born more from childhood disappointments than actual sentiment. He'd had an anxious mother and a father ill-equipped to deal with those anxieties. His mother had resisted the children's desires for a dog, and his father had gone along. What would happen when the dog died or got sick? She could tell them what would happen. They'd be miserable, and she couldn't stand that. Scott and his sister had appealed to their father. He had regarded them sadly, but shrugged, conceding without an argument, and Scott had learned the small, sad ways that marriage could eat away at a person.